The next time I go to Seattle, it'll be in a pine box." These haunting words came from Jimi Hendrix just weeks before his death. By then, he was being followed. His phones were tapped, and his manager was threatening him with planted drugs. The official story says he died from sleeping pills. But new evidence suggests something far more sinister. A murder plot involving millions of dollars, the Mafia, and a desperate manager with everything to lose. Jimi Hendrix was born on November 27, 1942, in Seattle. His mother, Lucille, was just 17 years old. His father, Al, wasn't there when Jimmy was born because he was in the army. Al had asked to visit his newborn son, but his boss refused and even punished him by locking him up for over a month. Jimmy's family was very poor. They often didn't have enough money for food or basic things. Life was so hard that Jimmy was constantly being sent to live with different relatives or foster families. He switched schools a lot, which made it hard to make friends or feel like he belonged anywhere. One thing he loved, though, was pretending to play guitar. He would carry a broom around and act like it was a real guitar. He did this so much that a social worker at his school wrote a letter asking for money to buy him a real guitar. Sadly, nothing came of it, and Al refused to get him one. Life at home wasn't any better. Jimmy's mother, Lucille, had a drinking problem. She was often gone, and when she was home, she and Al would fight a lot. These fights were so scary that Jimmy and his little brother, Leon, would hide in closets to stay safe. All of this made Jimmy quiet and withdrawn. He started spending more time in his own imagination, where he could escape from the chaos around him. When Jimmy was 15, his mother died. She was only 33 years old and passed away because of liver problems from her drinking. Losing her was heartbreaking for Jimmy, even though their relationship had been difficult. Years later, when someone asked him about his biggest wish, he said it was to be with my mother again. What made it worse was how Al handled her death. He didn't let Jimmy or Leon go to their mother's funeral. Instead, he gave them whiskey and told them that men don't cry, they drink to deal with pain. This was a cruel way to teach Jimmy how to handle grief, and it left him with a lot of unresolved feelings. Jimi Hendrix's story started when he got his first guitar at just 15 years old. It was a cheap second-hand acoustic guitar that cost $5. That little guitar changed his life. From the moment he picked it up, he couldn't stop playing. He practiced every day, sometimes for 8 or even 12 hours. He played so much that his fingers would bleed, but he didn't care. He loved the guitar. Jimmy took it everywhere, on the bus, while walking, even into the bathroom. His dad often found him asleep with the guitar on his chest, ready to play as soon as he woke up. Even though Jimmy was left-handed, he started playing like a right-handed person because his dad didn't like left-handedness. Later, Jimmy flipped the strings around and played it his own way, which made his sound truly unique. By the time he was 17, people thought he was a little crazy because he never put the guitar down. They called him Marbles. At 18, Jimmy's life took a bad turn. He had already dropped out of school because he didn't like it and wasn't doing well. Then, he got arrested twice in 1 week for riding in stolen cars. The second time, the judge gave him a choice: go to jail or join the army. Jimmy didn't want to end up in jail, so he joined the army right away. Just 2 weeks later, he became part of the 101st Airborne Division, known as the Screaming Eagles. Jimmy thought it sounded exciting and cool, but army life wasn't what he expected. Jimmy didn't last long in the army. He was unhappy and wanted out. After about a year, he started visiting the base psychiatrist. He told the doctor he was having homosexual tendencies, knowing that this could get him discharged. It worked, and Jimmy left the army in 1962. He later said this was just a way to escape and focus on what he really loved: music. After leaving the army, Jimmy struggled a lot. He moved to Tennessee and started a band called the King Casuals with a friend, Billy Cox, who he had met in the army. They played in small clubs and bars, mostly for black audiences in the segregated South. Times were hard. Jimmy was often broke, hungry, and sleeping in terrible places. He once said he had to sleep near garbage cans, where rats would run across him at night. Even with all this, Jimmy never gave up. He practiced every single day, no matter how bad things were. During this time, Jimmy worked as a backup guitarist for famous R&B singers like Little Richard and the Isley Brothers. These jobs helped him get better, but they were also frustrating. Jimmy's style was wild and flashy, and sometimes it stole attention from the lead performers, which caused problems. But Jimmy wasn't trying to copy anyone. He wanted to create his own music, something the world had never heard before. At just 21, in 1964, he started playing as a backup musician for the Isley Brothers. His first studio recording was with them on March 5, 1964, when they made a song called Testify. But this job didn't last long. He left after 7 months because his flashy style on stage grabbed too much attention, which the lead performers didn't like. Later that year, Hendrix joined Little Richard's band, The Upsetters. Things didn't go smoothly there either. On January 11, 1965, he recorded one song with Little Richard called I Don't Know What You Got, but it didn't do well, reaching only number 92 on the charts. Hendrix and Little Richard often fought because Hendrix's wild stage antics clashed with Richard's own dramatic style. The trouble came to a head on July 8, 1965, when Little Richard fired him for being late to the tour bus. Hendrix said he overslept after a late jam session, but Richard didn't forgive him. Hendrix's career as a backup musician was filled with clashes. In April 1965, he briefly played with Ike and Tina Turner. One night, on April 17th in Gainesville, Florida, Ike fired him right on stage after Hendrix played a surprise guitar solo during a song. Tina later said Ike felt threatened by Hendrix's talent. Hendrix also played with Sam Cooke once, in June 1964, at the Paramount Theater in Brooklyn. Cooke told him, "Kid, you're going places." Even though Cooke believed in him, Hendrix's path to success was still full of struggle. In October 1965, Hendrix moved to Harlem, hoping to find more opportunities. But his first night there was a disaster. After playing at the Palm Cafe, someone stole his beloved Fender Stratocaster. This left him heartbroken, but he didn't give up. A few weeks later, on November 2nd, 1965, he won $25 at the Apollo Theater's amateur night with a borrowed guitar. It wasn't much, but it gave him some hope. However, his music style didn't fit Harlem's taste for R&B and soul. On December 18th, 1965, at Small's Paradise, the audience booed him off stage for playing psychedelic blues. One person even yelled, "Go back to England," which was ironic since England would later make him a star. Life in Harlem wasn't just tough because of music. On January 7th, 1966, Hendrix was arrested for vagrancy while walking home late at night. He spent 2 nights in jail before being released. Around February 1966, desperate for money, Hendrix joined a gang called the Harlem Sharks. One day, during a failed robbery attempt, he got scared and ran away before anything bad happened. After that, he decided to leave crime behind and focus only on music. Not everything in Harlem was bad, though. On March 5, 1966, Hendrix had a late-night jam session with jazz legend John Coltrane. Coltrane told him, "Your guitar playing is going to shock the world." That moment gave Hendrix some encouragement during a tough time. In May 1966, Hendrix formed a new band called Jimmy James and the Blue Flames. He met a talented 15-year-old guitarist named Randy Wolf at a music store and invited him to join. Their first show was on June 14, 1966, at Café Wa in Greenwich Village. They played songs like Wild Thing, Like a Rolling Stone, and an early version of Hey Joe. During this show, Hendrix played guitar with his teeth for the first time, something that would later become one of his signature moves. The band practiced in strange places, including a chicken coop on Staten Island. It was there that Hendrix experimented with new sounds, using feedback and distortion, which became a huge part of his style. The Blue Flames didn't last long. On July 27, 1966, they recorded 4 songs, including Mr. Bad Luck, which Hendrix would later rewrite as Look Over Yonder. On August 8, 1966, during a performance at Café Au Go Go, Hendrix smashed his guitar on stage for the first time. This dramatic act became one of his trademarks. The band's final show was on September 16, 1966. After the show, Hendrix surprised his bandmates by announcing he was leaving for London the next day. This sudden move ended the Blue Flames, but started Hendrix's rise to stardom. In September 1966, Jimi Hendrix landed in London, invited by Chas Chandler, who had been in the band The Animals. Chandler had seen Hendrix play in a small New York club and thought he could turn him into a star. Everything happened so fast. Within 2 days of arriving, Hendrix found bassist Noel Redding and drummer Mitch Mitchell, and together they formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Their first practice was on October 6, 1966. That same day, LSD was banned in the United States. a strange coincidence for a band stepping into the psychedelic music scene. Just a week later, they were already on tour in France, playing alongside French pop star Johnny Hallyday. It was incredible how quickly things were happening for them. Chandler even changed Jimmy's name from Jimmy to Jimmy to make it stand out, and the name Experience reflected their wild, mind-blowing music. Hendrix was only 24 years old, and this was his first time leading a band. Before this, he had been a backup guitarist for stars like Little Richard. His bandmates were even younger. Redding was 21, and Mitchell just 20, but age didn't matter. Together, they created something unforgettable. In the UK, they became famous almost instantly. Their first single, Hey Joe, came out in December 1966 and reached number 6 on the charts. A few months later, they released Purple Haze, which hit number 3, followed by The Wind Cries Mary in May 1967, also reaching number 6. 3 huge hits in 6 months. Their debut album, Are You Experienced, came out soon after and stayed on the UK charts for 33 weeks. It only missed the number 1 spot because the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper was at the top. Hendrix didn't just impress fans, he shocked other musicians too. Just days after arriving in London, he jammed with the famous band Cream. Hendrix played a song called Killing Floor, and his guitar skills left their guitarist, Eric Clapton, completely stunned. Clapton later said Hendrix played every style imaginable, but it wasn't just for show, it was pure talent. Clapton admitted that moment changed his life. In June 1967, Hendrix played at the Monterey Pop Festival in California, his first big performance in America. The show became legendary. There was even a rivalry with The Who over who would go first, since both bands were known for wild stage antics. The Who won the coin toss and played first, smashing their instruments at the end. Watching from the side, Hendrix reportedly said, "If we're going to follow you, I'll pull out all the stops." Hendrix's set was electric. The band played hits like Foxy Lady and Purple Haze, but the finale was unforgettable. During Wild Thing, Hendrix poured lighter fluid on his guitar, set it on fire, knelt next to it like he was performing a ritual, and then smashed it. The image of Hendrix with his burning guitar became one of the most iconic moments in rock history. Interestingly, this wasn't even the first time he'd done it. He had burned a guitar months earlier in London, but that time, he got burned himself. By 1969, Hendrix had become the highest-paid musician in the world. At Woodstock, he was paid $18,000, more than anyone else. That's about $125,000 today. Other acts, like Santana, made just $750. Hendrix even built his own recording studio, Electric Lady Studios, in New York. It cost $1 million to build, and Hendrix paid $300,000 out of his own pocket. But fame came with problems. One of the biggest issues started with a terrible contract he signed in 1965. He got just $1 and a small percentage of future earnings, but in return, he unknowingly gave away his recording rights for 3 years. He thought it was just for session work, but it ended up causing him huge trouble later. When he became famous in 1967 with the Jimi Hendrix Experience, the company that owned the contract, PPX Enterprises, and its boss, Ed Chalpin, started suing him. They also went after his new managers and record labels. These lawsuits happened in different countries, and they blocked Jimmy from getting his royalties. This meant he had to keep touring to make money, even though he should have been financially secure. At one point, Jimmy even went back to the studio run by PPX to record a few songs, thinking it would help solve the problem. He did this twice in 1967, even though he didn't want those recordings to be released under his name, but Ed Chalpin ignored Jimmy's wishes and used the songs to make money. These fights over Jimmy's music rights continued long after his death. It took more than 30 years for Jimmy's family to win the legal battle. In 2003, they finally got control over his music, and in 2014, they got the original master tapes from PPX. By then, millions of dollars had been spent on lawyers, and Jimmy missed out on so many opportunities because of all the money tied up in these lawsuits. Meanwhile, Jimmy's problems with drugs and alcohol started early and got worse as he became famous. By 1967, when he was 24, he was using a mix of dangerous drugs like LSD, cocaine, amphetamines, and marijuana. People said he took LSD over 300 times in 1 year. At the Monterey Pop Festival on June 20th, 1967, he took LSD just 40 minutes before going on stage. Even though it was risky, that night became one of his most famous performances. He even set his guitar on fire. But his drinking was a big problem too. By 1969, he could drink more than a bottle of whiskey in one go. On January 4th, 1969, during a European tour, he destroyed a hotel room in Sweden. Hendrix also had trouble controlling his anger, especially when he was drunk. On the same night, he trashed the hotel in Sweden, he punched his friend Paul Caruso, and broke his nose. On February 12th, 1969, he hit his girlfriend, Carmen Barrero, with a vodka bottle during a fight. She needed stitches. Another time, on April 3rd, 1970, during a show in New York, a fan tried to climb on stage. Hendrix hit her with his guitar, and she fell back into the crowd. These moments were shocking because, when sober, Hendrix was kind and peaceful. But the drugs and alcohol brought out a different side of him. As a black musician in a mostly white rock scene, Hendrix also felt out of place. He grew up during a time of racism and segregation, and even as a superstar, he faced rejection. Many black radio stations didn't play his music, calling it too white. This hurt him deeply. In 1969, he said in an interview, "Sometimes it's too heavy to bear." He tried to connect with the black community by playing a free concert in Harlem on August 18, 1969. But people in the crowd threw eggs and bottles at him, calling him a sellout. Only a small group stayed to hear the show. To reconnect with black audiences, he started a new band, the Band of Gypsies, with 2 black musicians. But his manager didn't support it, saying it would hurt his career with white fans. Jimmy also suffered because of the people managing his career. His second manager, Michael Jeffrey, was one of the worst. Jeffrey had a shady past, and there were rumors he was involved in organized crime. Jeffrey also drained Jimmy's money. Even though Jimmy's band made $50,000 for each show, most of it disappeared into secret bank accounts. Jimmy wanted to fire Jeffrey, but he couldn't because Jeffrey supposedly planted drugs in Jimmy's luggage to blackmail him. By September 1970, Jimi Hendrix was falling apart. His manager, Michael Jeffrey, kept pushing him to perform non-stop. In just 3 months, he played 39 shows across Europe and the US, sometimes doing more than one set in a single night. He barely slept, just 3 or 4 hours most nights, and his health got worse. He was taking pills to stay awake, pills to sleep, drinking a lot, and smoking weed all the time. His girlfriend, Monica Danneman, said he had lost almost 20 pounds. He looked thin and sick, and his skin had turned pale. Fans began noticing he wasn't the same on stage. He would miss notes, forget lyrics, and look unsteady. At a show in Denmark on September 2nd, Hendrix only made it through 3 songs before walking off. A friend who saw him that day said he seemed lost, stumbling, and couldn't even tune his guitar. On September 6, 1970, Hendrix gave what would be his final performance. It was at the open-air Love and Peace Festival in Germany. The festival was a disaster from the start. Heavy rain and wind destroyed the stage and other equipment, and many big bands canceled. Security was run by a group of Hell's Angels who scared people and caused trouble. When Hendrix arrived, the crowd was angry and frustrated. He was supposed to play Saturday night, but the weather delayed his set until Sunday afternoon. When he finally came on stage, the audience, tired, wet, and cold, booed and cheered at the same time. Hendrix, clearly under the influence of drugs, seemed confused. He struggled to tune his guitar and told the crowd, "I don't care if you boo, just boo in key." Even though he was in bad shape, Hendrix managed to play 13 songs. But things kept going wrong. His amps stopped working more than once, and during Voodoo Child, Slight Return, some of the Hell's Angels fired guns into the air, causing chaos. Hendrix and his band ran off the stage right after the song and escaped by helicopter. The Hell's Angels then set the stage on fire, destroying what was left. Hendrix later told his friends that he felt terrible about the show. He thought he had let his fans down and couldn't stop thinking about the violence. In the weeks before his death, Hendrix said some strange things that seemed to predict what was coming. On August 26th, he told a friend, "I'm not going to be 28 years old. I don't know how I know, it's just a feeling." He even said, "The next time I go to Seattle, it'll be in a pine box." During his last interview, Hendrix talked about feeling like he had never truly lived. "I've existed for 25 years, but I've never lived," he said. After his death, people found a poem near his body called "The Story of Life." The last lines read, "The story of life is quicker than the wink of an eye. The story of love is hello and goodbye until we meet again." In those final weeks, Hendrix seemed paranoid. He told people he thought someone was following him and that his phone was being tapped. On September 14th, 4 days before he died, he told Eric Burden from The Animals, "I'm almost gone." Burden later said he believed Hendrix knew he was going to die. Jimi Hendrix died on September 18, 1970, but the events leading to his death are still surrounded by mystery. The official story came from his girlfriend, Monica Dannemann. She said they got back to her apartment in London around 3 a.m. after a party. Hendrix couldn't sleep, so at 7 a.m. he took 9 of her Vesperax sleeping pills. That was 18 times the normal dose. Monica claimed she woke up at 11 a.m. and found Hendrix unresponsive, covered in vomit. She called an ambulance at 11:18 a.m., but this story doesn't add up. The ambulance crew said Hendrix was already dead when they arrived, and rigor mortis had set in, meaning he'd been dead for hours. At the hospital, Dr. John Bannister said Hendrix's body was cold and blue, showing he had been gone for some time. What made things even stranger was how much red wine was found in his body. It wasn't just in his stomach, it was in his lungs too. Dr. Bannister said it was everywhere, even soaking his hair and clothes. It didn't match his low blood alcohol level, and people began to wonder if someone had forced him to drink it. The official cause of death was choking on his own vomit while under the influence of barbiturates. But there were so many questions. Hendrix didn't even like red wine. He preferred white wine, spirits. And the timeline Monica gave didn't make sense. She also kept changing her story over the years, which made people even more suspicious. Some think Hendrix was murdered. In 2009, a former roadie named James Tappy Wright said Hendrix's manager, Michael Jeffrey, admitted to killing him. According to Wright, Jeffrey forced pills into Hendrix's mouth and poured wine down his throat to kill him. Why? Wright claimed Jeffrey wanted to cash in on a $2 million life insurance policy he had on Hendrix. There were also rumors that Hendrix planned to fire Jeffrey, which could have been another motive. Jeffrey died in a plane crash in 1973, taking any answers with him. Other theories point to government involvement. Hendrix supported the Black Panther movement and was a powerful voice for change, so some people think the FBI or CIA might have targeted him. There were even rumors about the Mafia being angry at Hendrix for bringing drugs into a studio they controlled. Monica Dannemann remained a controversial figure. She claimed she and Hendrix were deeply in love and even engaged, but many people close to him denied this. Her story about the night he died kept changing, and some accused her of delaying the ambulance call because she didn't want anyone to find drugs in the apartment. Years later, she wrote a book about Hendrix, calling herself his spiritual partner, but her claims were often challenged. In 1996, after losing a legal case to Hendrix's ex-girlfriend Kathy Etchingham, Monica was found dead in her car. She had died from carbon monoxide poisoning, and it was ruled a suicide. Even after his death, Hendrix's music kept growing in popularity. He only released 3 albums while alive, but since then, more than 100 albums featuring his work have come out. The first, The Cry of Love, was released in 1971 and became a huge hit. In 1993, Hendrix was the highest-earning deceased celebrity, making $9 million that year. His unreleased recordings have kept fans excited, with albums like Valleys of Neptune and Both Sides of the Sky, introducing new songs and collaborations. Hendrix also became part of the 27 Club, a group of famous musicians who all died at the age of 27. This includes artists like Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse. Hendrix's death was a huge loss because he had already changed music so much in just a few years. People still wonder what he could have achieved if he had lived longer. His influence is everywhere, from music to the tools guitarists use today, ensuring his legacy will never be forgotten.